Hello, welcome to Breakdown with Tim and Ann. My name is Ann Stott.
And I am Tim McCarthy.
And we are here with the first episode of a podcast idea named Breakdown that came to me in a vision after Tim and I were commiserating in the aisles of Stop and Shop after the November election results, as I think many people were doing all over the country, commiserating in various places. So Tim is someone I've known actually since the first Trump regime. And we've always enjoyed chatting with each other, and it was great to run into him and really connect about everything that was going on. And I went home, and hours later, suddenly I just had this idea, Tim and I should do a show, and it should be called Breakdown. And we should have an emotional breakdown as I talk about everything we're feeling, and then we can break down what we think is going on in the country.
I love it.
So yeah, and then we're very friendly, but I didn't feel totally confident just writing you and saying, "Hey, do you want to do this?" But then luckily we ran into each other again.
Yep.
As happens in a small town, and I tossed it out to you, and you were so game, which was exciting.
I love the idea, and I love the fact that this origin story takes place in a produce aisle and Stop and Shop in Provincetown, surrounded by fruits and vegetables.
It's soul food.
Soul food
It's soul
and healthy food to sustain us over time. Yeah. I mean, it's true. We encounter each other so often randomly, walking down the street or at various events. Obviously, both of us are very active in the community and politics and arts and other kinds of things. And it was wonderful. I was very drawn to you. I always am, but I was really drawn to you that day because we were in the midst of a breakdown, trying to figure out what all of this means and how to make sense of this like profound and really sometimes profoundly disturbing moment. And so when I got your email after you'd gone home and had the kind of revelation, which I love, you're far more creative and imaginative than I am. I'm going to try to keep up in that regard here. But I was like, game. I'm like, game on, let's do this, right? Why not? And we're making it up right now in some ways. And this feels like a right way to go. Let's see where it takes us.
Yeah, well, we're actually in newly empowered old territory, right? Like we're in a very regressive moment, but it's also new in the sense that, there's a level of lawlessness and deconstruction of government and society that I think we're both pretty sure is going to go on that we haven't seen before.
Yeah. And that we're both really worried about.
Really worried about. Like deeply unsettled.
Deeply unsettled, yes.
And I feel like, one of the things that draws me to you is that you are, so learned and a professor, and I'm going to try to sort of keep up and be humble and just ask a lot of questions when I can't keep up on that front, but also very emotionally available about like the lived reality of where we are. And I think that's part of why this idea came to me with you and me, that we could experience these different levels. And you even added to it, like I was thinking the emotional breakdown and then like the sort of analysis breakdown. But then today you were saying like the societal breakdown.
Right. Yeah. Broadly, right? The breakdown of faith in institutions, the breakdown of the functioning of the rule of law, the breakdown of guarantees and protections of rights. I mean, there's so many things from the level of like institutions in our society, all of which are under scrutiny, but also suspicion. I think that may be even a too generous way of characterizing it. But then the breakdown of rights and relationships, and even how we like coexist and regard one another or don't regard one another. So much breaking down across the board, socially, politically, culturally, economically. That's all wrapped up in those other kinds of breakdowns of like, let's make sense of this. Like, let's break this down, break it apart to try to come to some fresh or deeper understanding, but then also the emotional breakdown of like, there are days when you don't want to get out of bed. There are days when you're like terrified of what's going to happen, where people are really at sea. I mean, we live out here at the tip of the Cape and in Provincetown and Truro and Wellfleet, and where I like to call that the end of America. And I use that as a double entendre right now. So it's like there's all of that. So it's really messy, that these kind of different meanings of breakdown. But when you said breakdown and you propose that as your kind of the outgrowth of that revelation after the produce aisle at Stop and Shop, it made perfect sense to me. It really felt like that's the right word, because the breakdown can be a verb, right? Something we do. It can be an experience or an emotional location, something we're undergoing or feeling in some way. There's so many different ways to sort of think about it, politically, institutionally, psychologically, right? Emotionally. And I love that. I love the fact that this one word, and I'm a language geek, like we're both, we both love language and we care deeply about language. You're a songwriter and an artist and an actress and all of these things. And I'm a historian and I'm a writer. And so both of us love words, obviously. And we're both talkers too. So we're really
both talkers. Here we are.
We really love words.
Doing what we love best, talking. Yeah, that's an Angels in America moment. We were talking about Angels in America the other day when Royko is doing what I do best, talking on the phone.
I know.
I mean, I hope that's the only thing I have in common with Roy Cohn, but
Right. Yeah. Well, Roy Cohn was also a queer. We have that in common.
Oh, true.
We're different queers than Roy Cohn was, but he's family, I guess. Is that what we're talking about? My mother, actually, when I was a little kid in second grade, I got a report card and I had good marks on my subjects, as they used to call them, but my behavior was like a nightmare. Handwriting and behavior are always a nightmare. They still are. And
really?
the only comment, I got like a D in behavior, and it said, Timmy talks too much. That was the one thing that the teacher wrote in the report card. And there was a little section that parents were supposed to respond to the teacher's comments. And my parents wrote, "You're telling us?" ? And that was in second grade. And my mother always jokes at me all the time. She's like, "Now you're a professor. You literally get paid to talk. How did that happen?" Like, so anyway,
it was there early. It was there early. I mean, when I was 10, I wanted to wear black and asked my mom for my first pair of boots. Like, sometimes we just know who we are.
Sometimes it's there from all along.
And I'm glad that you've embraced that part of yourself.
Yeah. But also you and I are both, I think, I not to be too arrogant about this or highfalutin, but I think both of us really do listen to and take in things, right? I mean, you're such a brilliant artist who has a voice of your own in your own art, but you're also able to inhabit these other people and these other places and times. And I've seen you act on stage, and I've also seen you perform, and I've shared stages with you. And like, you couldn't do what you do as well as you do it if you weren't listening and witnessing and all of those things. And I try to do that too in my own work. I mean, teaching is part of it's talking and sharing knowledge, but a lot of it's just like sitting in a room and listening to all the different people in the room share their own ideas and challenge yours and each other's. And that's part of community building.
Well, thank you for saying that. That's very kind. I mean, I feel like I'm always working on being a better listener, because it's, that's where there's so much richness. And I know, teaching is performing. Like, you have to be listening all the time when you're teaching. Like, are you losing them? Like, are they getting it? Like, even when they're not talking,
right,
you have to be in touch with, the energy in the room.
Yeah. You got to read the room.
You got to read the room. And there is a big room for us to be reading right now.
Reading.
The national room is fraught.
Yes.
The situation is fraught, as Tracy Letts said in August Osage County. I'm just going to keep quoting plays.
That's fine. Fine. Quote away. Yeah.
And we were also commenting on the different reaction to this election, was this Trump victory versus the 2016 Trump victory, and how the mood and the response are just so different from people this time around.
Yeah, it is. I mean, last time, you know, and people in the moment and then after the fact, I'm always, as a historian, I'm always interested in like how people remember things over time and how that changes, right? So there are a lot of people like, oh, I knew Hillary was going to lose, or I knew Donald Trump was going to win in 2016. I'm like, did you though? Maybe people did. I mean, I did not. And I will admit that. Like I thought that that Secretary Clinton was going to win, and I was shocked that she didn't. I couldn't believe that someone like Donald Trump could ever be elected president of the United States. Like that was like that wasn't even a thing for me. And yet, you know, this time around, I think I was relieved in 2020, and then this time around, I was like shocked but not surprised, because we could see what was growing and what the nation was becoming or descending to under his kind of reign and regime and influence. You know, so I do think people have had different reactions, but like when I think about 2016, like the day after that inauguration, like I went to Washington with a ton of my friends and marched with all sorts of people. You know, it was the largest one-day mass mobilization and protest in the history of the United States, right?
Isn't it the history of the world?
Because maybe the world, yeah. Well, I think globally, because there were so many all over the place, that it was globally that. But in the U.S. specifically, it was the largest mobilization, like dwarfed the March on Washington, right? The anti-nuclear wars, the different marches for LGBTQ equality, the Million Man March, right? I mean, the Women's March was a profound thing, and a lot of people really wanted to be part of that, whether they went to Washington or were somewhere else. And then this time I'm like, are we even going to watch the inauguration? Like, I'm not going anywhere. And
yeah, I mean, even before the Women's March, like the day after the election, thousands and thousands of people hit the streets all over the country. Like they just, and I think people who'd never been on the street before, didn't have political activist education or history, were just on the street. Like they just had this instinctive knowledge that something dangerous was happening and that they needed to place their bodies and their voices in the fray to make it clear that this was not acceptable or okay, or use whatever word you want. Right. And after the Women's March, I mean, the protests continued. Like there was that Science Day march.
Oh my God, right.
Hundreds of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people marched for science. Like, when will that ever happen again in our country?
Maybe it will happen again, depending on how much science funding they got.
It's true.
Yeah. No, so, that's right. You're right. I was reminded there were all of these different mobilizations that did sustain themselves.
Lasted for months. I mean, and then the summer of 2017, I mean, I didn't end up going, but I mean, I know lots of people who were basically in DC for weeks at a time, getting arrested in the Capitol over and over and over again to save healthcare. You know, I'll start crying right now thinking about like the people in wheelchairs getting arrested to save healthcare. See, I'm going to cry.
I know.
So, and this time, that is not what's happening.
No.
Right now.
We'll see, right? I mean, we'll see what happens. A lot can happen in a short amount of time, particularly in these times with the way in which social media can sort of mass mobilize in ways that are so expeditious and almost immediate, which is very different from like planning something, a march on Washington in previous years. So, I mean, who knows what will happen tomorrow or later today or next week. But one thing I do want to just, note is that many of us did go into the streets, and you and I both did in multiple ways over time, and have throughout our lives. We're both deep activists and organizers, as well as the other things we do. But we didn't do that violently. Those of us who went to Washington did not scale the Capitol and break windows and doors and defecate on members of Congress's desks and chant for people to be lynched and killed, including the sitting vice president of the United States, right? Which did happen after the 2020 election in the middle of a global pandemic, right? And So we didn't do that. I want to be real clear about that. That what
Thank you for
did
that
was
clarification.
something different, right? Something different. And I remember the Women's March. One of the things that I loved about the Women's March, and there were lots of critiques and debates about the Women's March and the hats and all the things. And I was part of that kind of, that those exchanges. But the day of the Women's March, when millions of people were marching in the Capitol that day, there was a joyfulness to that mode and manifestation of resistance, right? It was a beautiful day. It was cold, but it was a beautiful day. Tons of people were there, and there was a robust sense of power, joy, resistance, purpose, community, and all of it was peaceful.
All of it was peaceful.
All of it.
All of it. And now we're looking at the January 6th protesters getting pardoned, maybe.
That's exactly right.
And I think this is a beautiful way. I don't want to sidestep the personal breakdown part here.
No. Since we're still experiencing that too.
Yeah. And this sense of like, that we had the first time around, even in Trump's candidacy and then in the presidency, and that's been like, brewing on the sidelines and then in his next, political run, and now going to be elevated again to the highest office in the land. Yeah. This sense of like, this incredible manipulation and corruption of reality, like every day, all the time. That is so disturbing.
Yeah.
So disturbing. And my anxiety has spiked. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
In the last few weeks. And I think after the election in November, like I had a lot of grief. And I also had this like anticipatory sadness for the suffering. Like I know suffering is coming, and like
people are going to die.
People are going to die. People are going to suffer, and people are going to die because Trump is becoming president. And now it's sort of morphed more into anxiety, like this kind of buzzy, like can't go to sleep, unsettled, harder to focus. Because, and also the chaos, like I'm already exhausted. Like I haven't even fully engaged with yesterday's press conference.
No.
Because I'm like insanity, like chaos and insanity.
Yeah. It's really interesting that you would say chaos, because when you were talking about the anxiety level spiking, and, I'll just be fully transparent. Like I have struggled for many years with depression and anxiety, and I'm on medication, and it helps. And I will say I have definitely upped that medication, right? In the way of this election, like that's very real, fueling the pharmaceutical company, which is a whole nother conversation we can talk about sometime. But the way in which like I'm trying to mitigate against that, like I'm going to the gym all the time. I'm trying to read for pleasure. I listen to music more. I'm not watching television at all, really. Taking meds, like all of these things, trying to surround myself with people I love, right? People who I consider kindred spirits. So there's all these ways that I'm really actively focused on mitigating the anxiety, which you're so right to point out. But while you were talking about anxiety, I was thinking about these two C words, the cruelty word, right? Which that's the thing that put me into the darkest, most pessimistic places in the wake of all of this, and not just in this election cycle, but throughout, but just the way that Trump in particular, as the embodiment of that cruelty, but all of his people, the way that they treat other people with such disregard and disgust and dehumanization, whether you're talking about migrants or immigrants, or you're talking about trans people or queer folks, you're talking about women, right? Children, people of color, like just the disabled, like all sorts of people, right? Others, I like to say, right? All of people like us and people we're in community with, right, are being treated with such incredible cruelty, sometimes violent cruelty, when you think about separating migrant families and putting kids in cages, right? Or you know, dismantling the rights that women have to bodily autonomy, which is an act of violence, right? No question. I don't need to tell you that. But the cruelty is there. And then it's paired with the chaos, the other C word. It's paired with the chaos of keeping us constantly in chaos, right? And being unrelentingly cruel. For people like us, that is an impossible place to be stuck. And so, of course, our anxiety is going to rise through the roof of that, because we want, on the one hand, we want to tend to people who are suffering and tend to our own suffering. And at the same time, we want to do something about it to stop it all from happening, or to prevent it or mitigate it or what have you. And that's the thing for me that is so hard. Every conversation, we talked about this offline before we came on last week, but one of the things that's striking to me as someone who does kick in sometimes to the doer mode, I'm like, all right, shit's on, like, let's get to work, right? Let's get back in the fight. Like, there is part of me that goes there, which actually does come with its own focus, right? I can get laser focused on like a fight or an objective. But the thing for me is that every conversation I'm having with people about, what do we do? Like, how do we do it? What do we need to do differently? All of those questions that I'm having with policymakers and elected officials and activists and organizers and artists and teachers and all of the people that I am constantly talking to, right? People in my family, my friend circle. Every conversation is about, well, if this happens, we'll need to do that. Like, I don't know if this is going to happen. He said he was going to do this, but like this, if this happens, then we're really in danger and we got to put our bodies on the line. Or like, you know, maybe we should do this, or maybe we can do this to prevent that because that might come. Everything's a shoulda, woulda, coulda, might, maybe, you know, will he deliver, right? It's all uncertainty that links, that inspires the anxiety that comes from the chaos and the cruelty. Yeah. That I think is, as you said, fucking exhausting.
Exhausting.
Which,
I mean, I don't think Trump is so strategic that he's thinking I'm going to exhaust them. But I mean, it is part of the intention, right? We're overwhelmed, we're exhausted, we don't know which way to turn. And there were endless conversations about this between 2016 and 2020. Like, don't pay attention to that thing he said. That's just a distraction from the real thing. And it's like, well, it's all the thing. I mean, I think the bottom line is for him, well, now part of the bottom line is to stay out of jail. But I think the bottom line for him is that he wants to be Big Daddy and he wants white men to be in control of things.
That's right.
And he wants a lot of money.
Right.
And he doesn't really care how any of that happens.
Right.
You know, so I think, you know, that's my sense of his, like, you know, fundamental agenda, conscious or unconscious or whatever it is. But the exhaustion really becomes a tool in a way, or works to his advantage at the very least.
Yeah, no question. When you said white daddy, I'm like, yeah, but mad white daddy, right? Remember when J.D. Vance was, or was it? No, it was, who was it?
Tucker Carlson.
I all of them, they blend together. Like all the like aspiring, like angry white boys who are like surround Trump, right? His the deputy.
Angry. Let's be clear about this too. Like, angry, whiny white boys.
Oh, totally. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Like, absolutely. What's with the whiny thing? And it's almost like they're you know, like the nerds who weren't the cool, well, we know this has been documented and talked about, like the nerds who weren't the cool kids in high school, and now they've got power, but they're so whiny. And they're supposedly like standing up for a certain kind of, like, you know, strong masculinity that needs to be embraced. And it's like, you, Tucker Carlson? Like,
right, exactly. I know.
I don't think so.
Yeah, my model, I mean, I'm a white cis man, and my model of white cis masculinity is never going to be Tucker Carlson or J.D. Donald Trump and his boys and bros. Like, Jesus Lord. Yeah, no, it is. It's whiny and it's mad and it's white. It's very white and it's very male, and misogynistic and racist that come with those that kind of manifestation for sure. But one of the things that's like always for me, like the irony of Donald Trump. I mean, there are many, but is that like as exhausted as we all are from having to like deal with him all the time. Right. One of the reasons I'm not watching television news and haven't watched since the day after the election is because I just don't want to listen to people cover him. It doesn't even matter what they're covering or what's happening, whether it's a press conference, some appeal to the Supreme Court to like deny his sentencing, or, whatever the hell he's saying or doing on any given day or basis. Like, I just can't stand the coverage of it. I'm just not willing. This is another difference from last time. I'm just not willing to give him that time and real estate in my life. Like, as much as, he takes up too much oxygen and too much space anyway. But the irony of Donald Trump is that as exhausted as he makes all of us, he is so lazy and not hardworking. But one of the things I said the last time around was like, could you imagine how much worse his presidency would have been if he was intellectually curious and hardworking like most presidents are?
Yeah,
he's curious and lazy. He doesn't like get up and do anything until like 10 in the morning. He sits in bed watching TV. He doesn't read the briefings. They have to have like infographics and like one pagers for the intelligence briefings. This is just not a serious person, right? But he's a mendacious person, which is like the worst kind of combination. And then he's got all sorts of people who are just willing to like flow along in this way that is nuts. But the other thing too, that the thing that really terrifies me is it's first time around, I don't think even he thought he was going to win, right? And they certainly weren't ready because they didn't know anything about governing. They didn't even know what the institutions were that they had to like check and balance.
Or staff, like they had no idea who they had to staff. They didn't have a transition to a place. The reports are that Melania was like crying in the green room at the Hilton.
Yeah, exactly. People weren't paying it. Speaking of whiny, oh my God. But that was the last time. Like this time they're ready. They got a whole squad of folks that like were there last time, and new people who are coming in who've been like just hungry for this opportunity. So that's the thing for me that I'm so worried about. Is like last time they weren't ready and they were ill-equipped and ill-prepared. And disinclined to engage in a system they wanted to burn down and overthrow. But now they're occupying it and they want to change it and transform it to their purposes so that they can, perpetuate this like racist, misogynistic oligarchy, right, of billionaires and bros. And it's just, and the women who love them. And sorry.
That's so good, though. That's so good. Racist, misogynistic oligarchy. Wait, the men of the racist, misogynistic oligarchy and the women who love them.
And the women who love them. And the very, very consistent 52 to 53% of white women who vote for Donald Trump. Right? Like, it's, there are lots of people that are responsible for this moment in our world. But like, let's call that out too. Like Kamala Harris, who's only the second woman to be a viable presidential candidate, both women on the Democratic side, of course, right, got a lower percentage of women voting for her than Joe Biden did or than Hillary Clinton did. And I think I saw a statistic the other day that she got a lower percentage of women's votes in 2024 than any Democratic nominee and candidate for president going back to John Kerry in 2004. Like that's
wow, I had not seen that.
Depressing. That is so depressing.
Wait, part of me wants to like look that up and read about it right now.
Yeah.
Because if we're gonna get into the election,
and we don't have to. Sorry.
No. But on the one hand, she had 107 days.
Oh God, I know.
To run a campaign against a man who's been in the national spotlight for 20 years. Oh, and she got, is it the third or the fourth most votes of any presidential candidate in the history of our country? So, that's an incredible feat. Like
third most.
Third most, yeah.
I wrote this data down.
Okay.
She got just over 75 million. Trump got 77.3 million against her this time. So he actually won the popular vote, which was the thing that shocked me, actually.
And he got more this time than in 2020, right?
Right. He had 62.9 million in 2016, 74.2 million in 2020, 77.3 million in 2024. So he's gone up by millions each of the last three elections. But Biden got the most number of votes, which is 81.2 million in 2020, and then Trump is 77.3 in second place, and then she has the third most votes of any presidential candidate in history at 75, just over 75 million. So like lots of people voted for her, right? And in not unprecedented, but only recently precedented numbers. So she did really well, and she got lots of women to support her, and a lot of more men than I think some people anticipated. And she had broad support from lots of different kinds of groups, especially, of course, Black women who always understand the assignment and come through. But white women, right, are still voting for Donald Trump, like they're in a majority percentage, and that's like, what do we do with that? Because there's been lots of conversations about like the white guys who like, his bros, but like he has this coalition, right, that crosses lines of identity, whether you're talking about gender or race and ethnicity or class, right, that I don't think we've paid enough attention to, honestly. Like we talk about the Obama coalition, right, and how the Obama coalition that was formed in 2008, which sustained Barack Obama through 2 election cycles, was something that Hillary Clinton benefited from, and then Joe Biden as his former vice president, and then Kamala Harris as a woman of color who's running on the ticket. Like we've been talking about the Obama coalition for a very long time, which is of course a multicultural coalition, and et cetera, et cetera. But I don't think we're talking enough about the way that Trump has built a coalition and expanded it. That's the two shocking things about this election for me, is that Harris lost the popular vote. That shocked me. Yeah. And the shocking thing related to the fact that he got more votes now than he did in the previous 2 elections is that he is someone who was able to gain not just votes, but kinds of voters. Right, there were more different kinds of people voting for him to get him to 77.3.
Well, here's the other thing about that is that I think in 2020 and 2024, I know for sure he lost voters too. Right. Like I know people who voted for him in 2016 who did not vote for him in 2020. This is all through my family, by the way. There's almost no one. Or my high school, right? Like Facebook, high school, whatever. Like I know people who voted for him then who did not vote for him in 2020. I know of people who voted for him in 2016 and 2020 who did not vote for him in 2024. So each time he lost people and then gained even more people back, which is profoundly disturbing. I do need to say that I bristle. And I know you don't mean it this way, but we are inundated with these New York Times op-eds about everything that the Democrats did wrong. And now there's this, I'm trying to like coalesce like 4 different things you said into one. So this is going to get messy. But, this thing of people acting like they knew what was going to happen after the fact. And I remember 2016, and I remember watching, MSNBC, CNN, and I even flipped to Fox sometimes. But MSNBC and CNN, people were stunned, right? Like they had no idea what to say on the night of the election. They were just like, they were speechless about what was happening. And then 24 hours later, they had come up with this narrative of like the working class revolution. And they were like, so there was a working class revolution and, Donald Trump will now be president. They were acting like they knew what the fuck was going on. And it's like, oh, hold up. Like, hold up.
Are you saying this is 2024 or 2016?
No, I'm saying 2016.
2016. Oh, yeah, right, exactly. Yeah.
And so this thing of like people thinking they know what's going on, I think is, really important to talk about, because one of the reasons I think people are just engaging from media, and especially television media, is this thing of like, here's the story of what happened. Here are the 3 people we always have on the show to tell you what they always think that is they now are saying is the reason this happened. You know what I mean? And everybody's done with that, right? Yeah. But I think, oh wait, see, I knew this was going to get messy because I was trying to do too much at once. So we were talking about Trump picking up voters. We were talking about Trump.
I was talking about the we don't talk enough, or I think unpack or break down the Trump coalition, how it's grown and changed over these 8 years.
And so one other thing I want to talk about being inundated by these New York Times op-ed pieces, and I know this is not what you're doing, but like there are people writing for the New York Times right now who are very freely writing about how Donald Trump had a multicultural, multiracial coalition.
Right.
And I just want us to constantly remember that 85% of Donald Trump's voters were white.
Yep, absolutely.
And I believe 66 or 67% of Kamala Harris's voters were white.
Mm-hmm.
And it is true that the Democratic Party needs to look at itself as to why it lost certain Asian American voters, certain Latina voters, certain Black voters. But the Donald Trump phenomenon is a white phenomenon.
Oh, absolutely.
And there were people who were willing to look past that for one reason or another, because they didn't feel seen or heard by the Democratic Party. And there was something he was selling that felt like it spoke more directly to their lives. Like, definitely that needs to be addressed. But I don't, there's a way that I think a lot of white political analysts are abdicating responsibility for the white phenomenon that Donald Trump is by focusing on 6% of Black men shifting.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I can see where what I said could signal that. And
I know.
I'm glad you picked it up. I'm glad you picked up on it, because that's not what I mean, but I understand how that might have like flowed into the David Brookses of the world and the all those.
No, and I know that's not what you meant, but it's just such a, like, I just get all my hackles up. Is that what we say? Is that what we used to say? Hackles?
Yeah.
And any whiff of that, because I think the fundamental problem here is the white people, and he also picked up young white men who don't usually vote, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that the particular brand of white masculinity and of racist misogyny, white supremacist misogyny, that he embodies to his core and always has. I grew up in New York. I read about him in the New York Post and the Daily News all through high school, right? We knew who Donald Trump was and the fraud and carnival barker that he was in the 80s, right? So this is not new news, right? Who he is, right? He's the guy who put out the full page ad, right? To go after the so-called Central Park Five, or the now exonerated members of that who he wanted the death penalty for, because they were alleged to have, assaulted and raped a white woman, which of course didn't come to pass. Like, he's been doing this forever. And the brand of white masculinity and of racist misogyny that he offers up is incredibly persuasive to a overwhelming percentage of white people, right? And even of white women, and certainly of white men. But one of the things that's been interesting to me is that, because you're totally right, after the 2016 election, they were like, and then, by the morning they'd gotten their talking points, and they had this like new zeitgeist revelation, right, about the working class revolution and like blah, 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 and of course that sets up J.D. Vance, right? I mean, that's where he made his money, right? The what's it called? The Hillbilly's Elegy or whatever. Anyway.
Yeah, Hillbilly Elegy.
Not to give him much airtime, but like all of that, you're right. It was like a narrative that they like, poof, here it is. Here's the new narrative. But one of the things that's interesting, and I'd have to get the citation of this specifically, but there are scholars, and there's one scholar in particular I'm remembering, who did a bunch of really great kind of number crunching data analysis of exit polling. And part of that narrative that was constructed in that moment was that it's the white working class. And this scholar actually did the number crunching and said, actually, it's the white middle managers in corporate America and in the private sector. It's the white guys who have gotten to the middle class, who bought the whole mythology of meritocracy and the American dream, hook, line, and sinker, but they are stuck in these soulless jobs in the middle of late stage capitalism in the private sector, right, where they can't really afford to do the things they want. And they certainly don't have a gold penthouse and a gold escalator and a gold toilet and a third wife who's a supermodel, right? And all and names on everything and planes and automobiles and yachts, right? Donald Trump is a hero for those folks, like these middling, mediocre white people, right, who thought that they were entitled to this thing that would make them wealthy and powerful and whatever. And Donald Trump embodies that. And like, remember that he came down, he literally descended with Melania Trump on a gold escalator from a gold penthouse in a gold building with his gold names on it. And there are some people who think that that is the pinnacle of American success. I find it grotesque. But I'm not someone who's deeply invested in capitalism or late stage capitalism or penthouses or, you know, supermodels. But like, that's the interesting thing to me, is that it wasn't just the white working class men who voted for him, that he got a lot of middle managers.
Oh, no, it was a white revolution. I mean, he got a lot of white rich people. He won white people, like across the board in every category. No, you can't have a working class revolution where the rich people are all voting for you and know they're going to be taken care of. Like, that's not what's going on. But this is where, and you know, so we're being us, we're embracing who we are. So I'm really into astrology, and Trump is a Gemini. And I think he's like the worst manifestation of a Gemini.
I'm a Gemini.
You're a beautiful manifestation of a Gemini. When's your birthday?
The two things Donald Trump and I have in common, aside from some certain identity traits, is we're both New Yorkers and we're both Geminis. I'm June 8th.
You're June 8th. June 8th is so much better than June 15th. We don't know why.
I'll take it. I don't even know what that means, but I'll take it. Yeah.
So I mean, you know, signs can manifest in many, many, many different ways, right? Because we all have like a big chart, right? Like we have 12 different signs in 12 different houses. And so lots of different stuff is going on. And I think he's like the most dangerous Gemini manifestation either. And Gemini is the twins, right?
Right.
And that Geminis are communicators. Yeah. You are living a Gemini life for real. Right. Bob Dylan is a Gemini, for instance.
All right.
Lots of actors are Geminis. He can talk out of both sides of his mouth.
Right, that's right.
He can say to working people, you're getting screwed, and they believe him. And something about how he's saying it makes rich people know they're still covered.
Right. Oh, that's so true. Woo!
And that is one of his geniuses. And that's why he got white working class people and white rich people, because they knew they were covered. And this is the one, I don't even know what phrase to use this because I don't want to give him credit and I don't want to legitimize him, but he was saying to working people, you're getting screwed.
Yeah.
And everything around that was fucked up, like so fucked up, but nobody had been saying that to working people.
You're right.
You know, and so they were seen with what is happening in middle America to, you know, factory culture, manufacturing jobs, like, you know, all of these towns that are emptying out because there are no jobs, like they are getting screwed.
Yeah. You know? And it's interesting because, of course, the working class people of color are also getting screwed, and one could argue have been historically getting screwed for much longer in much deeper and more profound and violent ways. And yet they're not buying that and sinker, right? Which goes back to your point about the whiteness, right? Literally trumping all of those things, even though I do think it's important to analyze this across like race, class, gender, etc. But like at the end of the day, right, you know, America's favorite color is white.
Well, no, and that's where, I mean, like I said, everything around it, like everything else about the you're getting screwed, like everything around that is the white supremacy, is the misogyny, you know, all of it. And so, you know, the Black communities have been very clear
Right.
about
Right.
what his vision of what to do about that.
Right.
And honestly, at the end of the day, he doesn't have a vision about how people are getting screwed. He's just saying it, and it's working, and it's getting him votes. He doesn't care at all about the fact that people are getting screwed, and he's not going to do anything about it. And part of what's so maddening, you know, and I mean, just to full disclosure, I'm a registered independent who always votes blue. And although I was reminded by a friend, I want to say, do you remember this? When I was voting in New York State had the Working Families Party.
Working Families Party, fusion voting. I love that. Yeah. Yep.
And it was so nice to be able to vote for the Democratic candidate, but like put my energy behind the Working Families Party. And why does Massachusetts not need it? I don't know. We need to.
They had a foothold in New York. They were very successful in New York. It's funny because I lived in New York too. We both, you know, I'm from New York originally, upstate Albany, where I grew up and went to high school. And then I left and never came back. But I did graduate school and lived in the 90s in New York City. So I too voted. And it was actually in the 90s where the Working Families Party really took off in certain places. I know Connecticut had a really successful sort of organizing effort on there, New York and some other states. And I love that model, right? And I love it for many reasons. One, the one you just said is, you know, you can vote as a Working Families Party ticket for a Democratic candidate, but also the idea that you can then, by doing that, build the power of political parties that aren't the Republicans and the Democrats, which are both, without being both siderisms or false equivalencies, you know, they're both captured by corporate interests and by special interests and by the military industrial complex and all of that, and certain lobbies, right? And we need more political parties. The Working Families Party is a great example of what could be, right?
Yeah.
There's so much more interesting to me as a party in terms of its organizing efforts and where it's been able to get traction and do some really good work than the Green Party, which has become a joke. Right, not just because Jill Stein's a joke, but because you know, it's not a party that does a lot of party organizing in between elections, right? They've just become a kind of spoiler party in a way that to me feels like, I get it on some level for the burn it down crowd, which I'm not, but like, you know, what are you building in order to like change the dynamics of power, right? And coalition within the political system. Right. That I want that rather than
exactly,
you know, like some symbolic spoiler shit, which I'm
exactly.
Really and I voted for Ralph Nader twice. I voted for Ralph Nader in '96 and 2000. Full disclosure, you know, in New York. Yeah, and for that's another conversation, but for reasons that I can defend, even in 2000, I can defend. But
we should absolutely have that conversation. I'm now fascinated. And I didn't vote for him, and I would love to go back and look at all of that with you. We should definitely put that on the list for another episode. But what's so maddening, what's so insane making is, you know, this one thing Trump said that no one else has said, which is you're getting screwed to people, to working people. You know, they've now voted against. I mean, Joe Biden has done more
for working people
in this country that I can see than any other president in the 21st century, probably.
Yeah, and maybe in modern American political history, going back to LBJ, frankly.
Yeah, and some of that is opportunity, right? Like Obama had such intense obstructionism with Mitch McConnell and the, again, racist, power-hungry Republicans. If we want to remember that the Republican Party has been, you know, building the energy and the obstructionism and the sort of burn it down energy that Trump rode in on for a long time. So, I mean, Obama was hamstrung in so many ways, but, you know, literally, this is all Biden's been doing pretty much for 4 years, is trying to, you know, bring in more jobs and, build infrastructure and rebuild communities, and they just voted that out.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And, getting back to our origin story, right, that produce, those fruits and vegetables in the aisle at Stop and Shop, those prices ain't coming down because Donald Trump's going to bring them down, right? He has no interest in that. So he's, again, the forked tongue thing, right? He can sort of say, you're screwed, working class people. And also, like, don't worry, billionaire bros, I got you too. Like, he's able to do that, but he's also able to be like, I'm going to bring your grocery prices are too high. I'm going to bring your grocery prices down. And then the minute he gets elected, he's like, I don't know if I can really do that. It's more complicated. Blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, you never, ever were going to do that anyway. And I'm not saying that politicians always make promises they don't deliver on. That's part of politics, right? We know that. But I mean, he has a particular brand of lying. Right. I mean, it's one thing to like promise something and like have the intention of getting it done and then realizing that the mechanisms of politics make that impossible from a policy standpoint, given certain dynamics, and then you can't deliver on it. Like, that feels to me fundamentally different than the like, I'm going to bring down grocery prices. Meanwhile, no, you're not.
Well, yeah, I had this exact conversation after the 2016 election at Thanksgiving with a relative, where they were like, well, all politicians lie. And I said, it's one thing to, like, shade the sense of what you've done to make it look prettier, right, or to promise things that you don't get to because governing in this country feels fucking impossible. Right. And it's another thing to send out a tweet that you wrote on your own Twitter account saying climate change is a Chinese hoax.
That's right.
And then when someone in a debate says, here's your tweet that says climate change is a Chinese hoax, and you say, I never said that. Like, that is a whole other level of dysfunction. It's actually, I feel like one of the reasons I'm having such a hard time with all media, and I am still reading things, and I don't watch TV in general, but is because no one's acknowledging that, like, if we're in a big family, like, we're in a profoundly dysfunctional relationship right now with this person, with this deeply troubled person.
From a dysfunctional family.
From a dysfunctional family, who is a drug addict by all accounts, right? Like, I mean, many, many people who've worked on The Apprentice or whatever have reported that he's snorting Adderall, which must be why he fell asleep in court, right?
Right.
I mean, I assume. I don't know.
Go in the bathroom and do a bump.
Exactly.
With his son.
Like, and part of what holds, not everybody, but a lot of people, a lot of white people, to him a year from now, even when he hasn't even begun to do anything that might address the ways in which people are getting screwed, is the racism.
Yeah.
And the cruelty, and this sense that he's expressing some entitled white ethos,
yeah,
that people want the country to return to. And they believe, like I said this in a live on Instagram, like, part of what's going on here has nothing, like, it has nothing to do with policy or numbers, and the Democrats are wagging their fingers at each other and like, we should have done this instead of that. And I can do that too. Like, I can break down, what I didn't like about what Kamala did. Like, I don't think she should have, appeared with Liz Cheney 4 times. Like, I think she should have done more about Gaza, like, whatever.
Right.
But like, if we don't acknowledge that there's something really sick happening here, I don't know if we ever get out of it. And I understand, I mean, I'm just like spilling out now what I'm sort of running around in my brain. Like, politicians' job is to sort of like hear what people need, respond to that, set a vision for where we can go, and like take people there. And right, like, Obama was the master. Like, we may never see his like again, right? And obviously I think Michelle could do it if she wanted to, and she wants no part of that, and I respect that completely.
Oh she's like, where's the helicopter? Get me out of here. Like, where is the helicopter? And I'm with her. I would have gone right on that helicopter with her. I cannot blame.
I think that should be I think that should be her next book. Where's the
helicopter? Get me out of here. Oh my God.
And actually,
God bless Michelle Obama, but yeah.
God bless. And actually, I think Kamala was pretty great at it. And honestly, between Hillary, Joe, and Kamala, I think she did the best job of handling Trump.
No question.
No question, hands down. But so the politicians have to do that, but like, how do we talk about the fact that something really deeply sick and dysfunctional is happening here?
Well,
and of course, the people, what?
We talk about it, which is what we're doing. Yeah.
Which is what we're doing. But I mean, psychologically as well as politically, right?
Yeah.
It feels to me like when you have a friend who's in a dysfunctional relationship with a narcissist or a bully or whatever, and you have that moment where you can talk to them and you're like, like, you're better than this. Here's this person over here who's great, who likes you, like whatever. And there's no logic that breaks through that, right? It's like the person's like, but this person sees me in a way that I've never been seen before. You don't understand our connection. I feel like
them.
What?
I can fix them.
I can fix them.
Right.
And I feel like that level of dysfunction is at work here.
Yeah. I was laughing before when you said, even though on some level there's nothing to be laughing about, but I'm as you know, I'm a gay Irish Catholic, so gallows humor is my wheelhouse. So I'm like, look, I always say that the two strongest well springs of humor are a deep appreciation and sense of the absurd, and a capacity and determination not to take yourself too seriously, right? So humor is absolutely essential. Laugh to keep from crying, as the saying goes. But the reason I laughed earlier when you were talking about having the conversation with a Trump voter, and you were like, at Thanksgiving, I was thinking in my head, like, why do they have Thanksgiving and then like the Christmas, Hanukkah, like the holidays right after the election? It's like I mean, I remember like I was teaching right after that, and like the week before Thanksgiving, I just like blessed my class. I was like, for those of you who are going home and are going to have these tough conversations, like Godspeed, like I just like, and the number of people, my students were like, I'm not going home. I'm going to, with some friends somewhere else. I'm having Friendsgiving this Thanksgiving. It's like, but let's talk about that. We talked about the emotional, psychological, that part of breakdown, right? The sense that we're losing control of our sanity, of the truth, right? Of our, the spike of anxiety, depression, all the things that we talk about psychologically, right? And you and I have talked about that as one of the things. I mean, we literally had a breakdown in the produce aisle at Stop and Shop because we were both like really in a bad place after this, right? And I mean, we're hardly the only ones, right? That is a Stop and Shop in Provincetown. Most of the people in that grocery store were our kindred spirits.
We were the Walking Dead, all of us in there.
It was like ghosts everywhere. Yeah, totally. And and I don't think that we talk enough about emotion in politics in terms of the anger and the aspiration, right? Like Trump, the like induces rage in people, and then they have to put it somewhere, so they attack. That's part of the cruelty, right? And then you just talked about Obama, and he was a kind of masterclass in that aspirational rhetoric, the hope and change, that like making us feel like a new day is possible, right? Or that it was a new day that we were like entering into, and whether or not any of that is true, whether it's as bad as the rage produces or as dreamy and gauzy as the aspiration produces, like that's emotion, right? That is that, and everyone knows this. Everyone who does political communications work, right, and campaign work and field organizing work knows that like it's those emotional and affective connections, it's the storytelling, it's the lived experience, it's the shared struggle, it's all of those things. But we don't, I think, talk enough about the emotional toll that the outcome of elections takes on us. And I think that we've really been experiencing a particularly intense sequence of emotional responses to these elections, right? And I mean, even if you think about January 6th and the insurrectionists, right? That was an emotional reaction to a different kind of political outcome that you and I may have experienced as relief or whatever, or joy or temporary, return to sanity or whatever. But like the 2016 election, 2024 election for people like us, and we're not like mainstream liberal Democrats. We're like lefties and artists and intellectuals and, people who understand. We have robust critiques of the systems that we're all embedded in. And like, I mean, I'm not a Democratic Party operative. You're a registered independent, right?
Yeah.
I mostly, I mean, sometimes I'm excited to vote for Democrats, right? Here in Massachusetts, I love Elizabeth Warren and there's others. But like, usually I vote for Democrats as a stopgap measure to mitigate the other craziness. And, but we have experienced in different ways, I think, after 2016 and now after 2024, like an emotional and psychological break or breakdown that is real that I don't think we talk about enough. Certainly out loud in public, as opposed to like, us seeing each other in the street and like stealing away to, hug and, commiserate.
Yeah, I agree. And I think certainly in terms of like media that covers politics, and I'm not in any way in touch with all of it, but the stuff I see, after the election turned very quickly to like finger wagging and, Monday morning quarterbacking and again, and we've talked about this, like before all the numbers are in, you know what I mean? Before the full story has been told, which, I think is another kind of problematic, but, yeah. And I'm trying to think now, like, I mean, I was pretty devastated in 2000 when W won.
Yeah.
And, and I remember how I felt. I was pretty checked out. I was going through a very hard time in 2007, 2008, or long-term relationship had ended. And I wasn't as like engaged or connected as I usually am. But I remember how I felt when I saw W get on that helicopter. Speaking of helicopters, like I remember how I felt, but it doesn't hold a candle to what's happening now.
No, absolutely. I mean, I worked on the Obama campaign in 2008.
You did?
Yeah. I was part of his, at the time, called the National LGBT Advisory Council, and I actually joined the campaign in 2007, like really early, like I mean, at a time when very few people thought he was actually had a shot at being president. And then I was at the inauguration, and I was very checked in. I actually took some time off from teaching to do campaign work in the spring of 2008, which like I had never ever done before, and I never worked on a presidential campaign before, actually, like ever.
Okay, so you saw the potential of Obama when people were still just assuming Hillary was going to be the candidate.
Oh yeah, I was on. I came out for Obama in July of 2007.
And I'm just curious, what made you what was that decision?
I think for me, it was a number of things. I think his family story was something that, speaking of emotions, that really moved me as someone who I was given up as a child, as a baby, and adopted into my family. And So I'm not biologically connected to anybody in my family, and I have a very, very, capacious and interesting family, and that has become increasingly multiracial over time. And obviously, my husband and I being queer, and so my family has always been unorthodox, to say that, it's kind of a combination of misfits. And so I appreciated the ways in which he wrestled with the multitudes and contradictions of his own family and his own upbringing and background, and that he wasn't from a fancy background. I grew up in a working class family, also not fancy, went to the same schools, Harvard and Columbia, right? So there was like that, like we had both, I'm not comparing myself to Obama, but the resonance of like, getting into a place like that. He went to Columbia for college, and then Harvard. I went to Harvard and then Columbia. So like there was that. And he was actually, I remember him speaking at a rally. I actually didn't realize it at the time, but later on I connected the dots that my senior year was his, I think, last year's as law school, when he became the first Black editor of Harvard Law Review. And I remember reading the Crimson. It was like national news. And my tutor in Quincy House was friends with him and Michelle at the law school. And he spoke at a rally when Derek Bell, the famous critical race theorist who wrote Faces at the Bottom of the Well, he said he was going to leave Harvard Law School unless Harvard Law School tenured a Black woman, which they'd never done. And then Harvard Law School said they weren't going to do it. And then he went to NYU. And then later on, Lonnie Guinier came and became the first, my dear late friend Lonnie Guinier, God rest her soul, came to be the first Black woman, but Derek Bell had left. President Obama, then law school review editor Barack Obama, spoke at the rally of students in solidarity with Derek Bell to sort of call on Harvard Law School to appoint a Black woman tenure. So I was at that protest on campus, and he spoke. And I remember thinking like, oh, this guy's really smart. He's very compelling, And then later on, like connecting the dots back to that, it was like very strange. And this was, so like there were all these kind of resonances. And the other thing that I really appreciated about him was that he his campaign was putting together an LGBT advisory council, of people who could advise him on those kinds of policies. And the interesting thing is that he did not go to New York, San Francisco, and LA initially to find the people on that advisory council, although there were those people too, but he went to Chicago, where he was a community organizer, and he came to Cambridge and Boston, which is a vibrant LGBTQ community that has done, like, in some cases, more progressive, grassroots, and radical kinds of queer work. And so it was very interesting, like, who he was, like, reaching out to, and it just felt very different from the people that Hillary Clinton, who I also respect, and, I actually worked on her campaign in 2016 a little bit, very different from like what the Democratic establishment was doing. And for, at the time, Obama was an outsider in so many ways. And I was drawn to that too, because I see myself, even though I'm in the belly of the beast a lot in my life now, I wasn't before. And I there was something about him that spoke to me in that way, to say nothing of all the communication skills and the, inspiring, books and story and all that, and Michelle Obama, who's a total rock star, and the kids are cute, right? I mean, there were like a lot of things, but for me, it was emotional, really, initially, before it was like policy oriented or political in that way. Mm-hmm. Anyway, that was a very long answer to a simple question, but
no, I loved hearing all of that. No, I loved hearing all of that, and I mean, he could come in with an outsider energy because he was so young, right? Like he didn't have a lifetime of decisions that he had to, stand up for, right? Or speak to. No, I mean, he's an anomaly. Like he's a very special person, clearly.
But also, like, from a policy perspective, like, also problematic. Like almost every Democrat I know. I mean, I'm not someone who's like easily moved by like Democratic politicians. I'm moved by small d Democratic people, whether they're inside the system or outside the system, right? That's why I like Warren and I like Sanders and AOC and my one of my great heroines of all time, Barbara Lee from San Francisco, like, John Lewis, like those are the Democrats I can get fired up about, right? Not Maxwell Frost, this young brother from Florida who I think is so impressive. But it's like, mainstream Democratic, big D Democratic Party politicians are not the people who move me generally in the world. But that did feel different. But then, I started criticizing him like right away when he came into power, because I was like, look, I helped, like our group helped shape your policy agenda on some level, and like you need to deliver, enough of this. And was I sensitive enough to all the constraints that he was operating under as the first Black president, all that? I think I was on some level, but probably not on every level, because I wasn't in his administration or anything like that. I had no desire to go to Washington after he got elected. For me, the campaign was like an organizing moment in American history that was exciting. But I'd never done that before, and I've never done it since, frankly. So it's not something that was in some ways an anomaly itself. But from a policy standpoint, Obama was pretty, he was liberal, middle of the road. Certainly not I wouldn't say a left progressive president. We haven't had a left progressive president in my lifetime.
Well, I mean, here's the problem: is the country just too big? I mean, we can't do anything about it, but
too diverse. I mean, that's the irony of this moment of like all the anti-woke, anti-DEI shit. The reason why we're so dysfunctional as a family, if you want to use that metaphor, is because we're so different. We're not just big. We're like all over the place.
We're all over the place. And I mean, I had this moment. So my first presidential vote was Bill Clinton in 92. I missed Dukakis by 1 week.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah. My birthday's November 15th, and the election happened, the first Tuesday of November 1988, and I missed that one. And one of the things that Clinton in that moment, and it's really hard for people who weren't there to go back and try to tell them, like, it's really hard to tell a 25-year-old like what it felt like when Bill Clinton was running for president. And not that I was so young, I was forming in many ways, but there was such an excitement around him and an energy around him. And one of the things he talked about was holding China accountable for human rights abuses, because which was a much more active conversation then than it is now, because the money's just taken over. But I had studied Tibetan Buddhism in college, and so I really liked that about him. I mean, among other things. And, he got elected, and he met with George H.W. Bush like a week later, and he came out of that meeting and basically said, like, I will not be changing anything about our China policy. And it was this, youthful, devastating moment of feeling that betrayal. And, since then, I'm just very clear, like, some especially younger politicians running for president can say a lot of things that they're not really going to get done. And you have to look at like the sort of fundamental character of the person and the fundamental, like, what are the values that they're resting their policy choices on. And at the end of the day, I'm kind of going to vote blue no matter what. I mean, there's just not, it's, that's what it is. So, I wasn't surprised that Obama couldn't get done the things he said he was going to get done. Or, one thing I really love that he talked about actually was shutting down Guantanamo.
Yeah, that's right. And then didn't.
He didn't. And I remember like a few years into his presidency, I had like lost track of that issue. And so I looked it up, like, where are we? And my initial reaction was like, oh my God, he didn't do it. But I think he reduced the number of people there like by 75%. Like, he did everything he could do but close it. Like, he was handed this impossible task from Cheney and W, and he did a lot on it. And more than he had to do. You know what I mean? He could like, I don't know how many millions of people were pestering him to keep up on the Guantanamo Bay issue. And he did a lot, you know what I mean? And I do see that like governing is very difficult, and governing a country this size with such competing, conflicting values that are only getting more is very, very hard, you know, which doesn't mean I'm not going to fight for the things I think they should do. And it doesn't mean I don't live in a state of constant disappointment with the Democratic Party, basically.
Constant, right. It's so interesting that you would say that, because one thing that you reminded me of with the Guantanamo piece is, and the mention of Cheney is, actually the first reason why I paid attention to Barack Obama was because he was the only candidate who was denouncing the wars. The only Democratic candidate. The rest of them had either voted for the wars in Congress or been fully supportive of them in other ways, morally supportive of the wars, which is, of course, a contradiction. And so I was actually drawn to him as a kind of an anti-war candidate, because I was deeply involved in the peace and anti-war movement, and so much so that I got in some trouble after 9/11. I spoke at a rally 3 weeks after 9/11 on campus, and I denounced the coming war in Afghanistan, which of course at that time was like not a popular opinion.
No,
one, your table's ready, you know, and then a couple weeks after that, I found myself like blacklisted by this organization, like a campus watch organization that Lynn Cheney founded. And I was number 32 on a list of 117 American academics who were short on patriotism during a time of war. And so I got in all sorts of trouble. And then I just doubled down. I'm like, you know what? These wars are absurd. They're unjust. And I protested them all along. So like when he showed up, I was like, oh, okay, here's like an anti-war person. Hillary Clinton was not an anti-war person. Neither was Joe Biden, frankly, at that time, or any of them really. And so anyway.
No, Hillary's a hawk.
Clearly, oh, of course, Hillary's very conservative in foreign policy.
Yeah, and she really believes in that. And now, I mean, I have to say, it's been very hard to hear her talk about Gaza. You know.
Yeah. Yep.
The few times I've seen stuff from her, it's just like I can't believe that is where she's coming down. But no, she's a hawk. And believes in that sort of like America uses its goodness to bring goodness to other places, which, that narrative is so problematic on so many levels.
Yeah. But she's like a soft power and hard power person, right? Like when it comes to like human rights issues, notwithstanding the Gaza exception, the Palestine exception, which of course is always there. And, Democrats are so guilty of this, almost all of them. But she's, on some human rights stuff. You talked about China, right? She went to the Women's Conference in Beijing and gave that famous speech about women's rights and human rights. And so like she has this kind of soft power thing going on sometimes when it comes to those issues, but then on matters of war, right? And like military strength and these things, she's a total hawk. And one has to wonder whether or not she feels like she needs to be that, because she's the first woman who like stepped into the kind of prominence that she had stepped into in terms of certainly as a presidential candidate, but even Secretary of State in other ways, whether she feels compelled to be that way, right? I wonder how much identity plays into that. Like, I mean, Obama was criticized a lot by even the people supported him within the Black community in droves. Like he was criticized for not being way more progressive on the criminal justice system and, policing and those kinds of things. And, I wonder if his Blackness and Black identity constrains him in terms of being able to talk about issues that are especially racialized, right, and intensive. And I wonder if like her hawkishness is not a function of the fact that she's a woman playing in a boy's world or a man's world, and she feels compelled to do that. And I don't know. I mean, who knows? It's complicated.
I think I read an article about how after Obama gave that speech after Trayvon Martin was shot.
Yeah.
And his numbers dipped.
Oh, right. I know. Yeah.
So I think white people, he's a light-skinned Black man who grew up with white family, and is clearly very Black identified, as I heard Ta-Nehisi Coates point out once, like, you don't build your political career out of Chicago if you don't love Black people, right? Like, but he walked this very, very, very fine line that I cannot imagine. I mean, talk about stress and anxiety. Like, I don't know
Oh,
how you
absolutely.
lived through those 8 years as them. Like, I really have no idea how you survive that on that level. And maybe some of that's true with Hillary. It feels like she should be unburdened from some of that now. Like I, I feel like, I don't know, my gut on the hawk thing with Hillary is that might be who she is, but
Yeah,
then
maybe.
maybe it's come over years. So since we brought up Gaza
Yeah.
and and that is definitely one of the things I felt grief about, like in the wake of the election was, I didn't vote. I mean, yes, in some way I voted for Kamala Harris in spite of Gaza, but I also voted for Kamala Harris because of Gaza, because even though there has been, repression and censoring and, the shutdowns, and you've seen this up close at Harvard, but like all of this, university censorship, but then, the Democratic Party's funding and complicity in what I am calling a genocide. I don't know.
I do
Okay.
too. Yep.
With Trump, there's no avenue. There's no way to even try to have a discussion. There's no, he's ready to put, Trump Tower Gaza up, like he's just going to let Netanyahu do whatever he wants, which Biden basically has too, but Biden feels the pressure that's been on him more. And there would be more potential for democratic process to change U.S. policy. And now he doesn't give a shit.
Right. Right. Well, Jared Kushner came to Harvard last year and said, don't worry about Gaza. Soon it will be the Riviera of the region. Literally said that. I mean, it was like to gasps. Right. This was like in the thick of the first part of the wake of October 7th. This was like, sometime in the middle of the year last year. And I remember I wasn't there, but I heard about it and I was like, that is ghastly. I mean, talk about genocidal, right? Like how do you make it the Riviera of the region? You get rid of all the Palestinians, right? And either you kill them or you displace them, right? But you annihilate them by any means necessary in order to create a blank slate or whatever, what the Europeans used to call the virgin land here when they conquered the land where all these people had always lived and decimated the indigenous populations, right? These stories are as old as time, right? But in this time, right, the way that the Democratic Party and even some of the progressive members of the Democratic Party, right, are sort of hemmed in to this like long-standing sort of, Israel is our best friend in the region. I mean, I heard a data point years ago because I was part of a LGBTQ delegation to Palestine and Israel in 2011, I believe. And I remember going, and then I'd never been before. And I remember thinking on the way home, like, I can't unsee what I saw, right? The apartheid, the segregation, the dehumanization, the checkpoints, all of that, the military surveillance apparatus that governs every move that everybody makes there, including tourists, right, is like unmistakable in its oppressive quality. And I heard a statistic years ago that the United States gives more aid money, right? They call it aid money. That's a very broad and nebulous category, of course, but aid money to Israel than it does the entire continent of Africa. The entire continent gives more aid money to Israel every year than the entire continent of Africa. And I don't know if that's still true, but it might be. Maybe it's even worse now because of the war after October 7th. But like, there are options to, for more mainstream Democrats who are beholden to that longstanding narrative and relationship, like Biden clearly is, and maybe the Clinton is as well. But like, there's a world where you can be like, look, like you can't do what you're doing. You might not agree with people who are calling it a genocide, but like you're moving closer to genocide than away from genocide by doing this. And we're not giving you any more arms because we want a ceasefire. And if there's not a ceasefire, you're not getting any more money or weapons. And that's your choice. right? But nobody in American government is willing to say that, right? Or like, here are
Nobody.
weapons, and then here's some humanitarian aid if indeed the IDF and other forces in Gaza are going to be willing to let it through, right? And it's like, okay, like what? That's not public policy. That's another kind of forked tongue, right?
Yeah.
And
huge forked tongue on the Democratic side, massive.
And I will say that you're right. I think you're totally right that like there's no pathway to a ceasefire or any kind of, anything that would be seen as a dignified, humane treatment of Palestinians. I'm not even talking about equality and freedom or rights, right? I'm just talking about dignity and humanity, which are also important, of course. Right? There's no hope for that with Trump, right? Right? That we know that, but like, what's the pathway with a kind of Harris or Walz administration? And I do think that she showed signs at times of shifting the way she talked about the assault on Gaza and the displacement and decimation of Palestinians. She did talk about that in a way that was, and I could be parsing words here and looking too generously for this, but it felt to me like she was trying to signal that there would be a shift in policy. Whether or not there would be, we'll never know, of course. But
what's interesting is, so what you're, it's so shocking, like how small the shift was in her language and how profound it was, right? Because it was very small, but just saying self-determination for the Palestinian people was something have we heard those words in our adult life from someone coming out of the White House?
Yeah,
I don't think so.
I don't think so. And Biden certainly hasn't said that.
No, absolutely not. And she talked more about the suffering of the Palestinian people and how that needs to end. And then she pulled back.
Yep, she did. Yep.
She pulled back. And I am wildly curious about that. Like, where did that decision come from? Is she, clearly, like, she's spoken at AIPAC, she gets AIPAC money, like, she has multiple points of connection to the state of Israel. And
her husband's a Jewish American, right? She practices with him, right? The faith traditions of the Jewish people. So was it that they did polling that showed that if she kept speaking for Gaza more, they would lose more Jewish people than they would gain Palestinian rights activists? Yeah.
Was it that she genuinely sort of is mostly okay with what Israel is doing? Like,
did she take for granted the young people vote? Because young people obviously skew to Democrats by wide margins, right?
Yeah. What was that moment? And I don't think we'll never know like what it cost her. Her margins were strong enough in most of the swing states that I haven't looked at these numbers in the last few weeks, but I don't know if I think we can say Gaza was the one issue. I don't think it was.
No, it was an issue for sure.
Look, right? It dampened my enthusiasm, and enthusiasm is a huge thing. Like, I wanted, like, there are things about Kamala Harris that really excited me. Number one, voting for the first Black Asian American woman to be president. Like, that excited me. Like, there was a, that whole joyful warrior thing. I dug that. Like,
yeah, I did too. The Vibe Summer. I was all in for the Vibe Summer, totally.
And I knew that she would never do the things I would want a president to do. And I wanted to be excited to vote for her. And honestly, I couldn't be as excited as I wanted to be because of Gaza. Like,
same. Especially being on campus with the explosion of activism and oppression and repression that was going on. Our campus was on fire last year. Not, of course, the same way that Gaza's on fire, but but our campus, like so many campuses, were, we were just, it was a very intense year, and I was in the thick of that because I teach courses on the history of social movements and activism and all of these kinds of things. And the student, I have a lot of students that self-select into the classes I teach, and I know, quite a number of the students who are involved in pro-Palestinian organizing and who are part of the encampment and so forth. And I'm also on a faculty disciplinary board for one of the schools that I'm on the faculty of. So I had to sit in judgment. I mean, we decided not to punish the students ultimately, but the pressure to punish student activists writ large. I mean, Harvard did something last year in punishing students and deferring their degrees that no university had done that I can recall since Columbia in '68.
Which thing was that? I don't.
The protests at Columbia in '68, which were like the very famous Columbia, they kicked students out, they denied them degrees, and so Harvard took a much heavier hand than it ever had before. And generally speaking, universities do not deny students the right to exist in their university or the degree from their coursework lightly, right? This doesn't happen. It's not a routine practice. And yet Harvard decided that it was going to do that last year, and it did. Not everywhere, not at every school, not with every student. And there was no consistency across the board, but it was draconian and it was repressive. And I was caught up in all of that, right? And so for me, that was so top of mind, in addition to my connection to Palestine and Israel and to especially people who are working for liberation and peace in that region. Jewish Israelis, Palestinians, right? People of different faith traditions, right? A deep and long standing connection to those folks for a decade and a half now, right? So I was very much top of mind for me. And I was disappointed at every turn, even when there were some shifts that I was detecting with Kamala Harris. And I think sometimes, and I'll be really forthcoming about this, I was excited about her candidacy too, and relieved, frankly, when it happened, because I was just like, we got to get out of this. This is untenable with Biden running for re-election. But the thing, and I think I probably was, if I'm being really honest, searching for a shift, willing that into existence and hoping that he, for any one of a number of reasons, would be more progressive on that. And I do think that she did shift. And I think that needs to be marked and noticed, as you've said and I've said, that she did change the way she talked about that. It gave different emphasis to different things, but and she said ceasefire and all those things. And I remember I said to my husband at one point, when she did shift the messaging for a moment, I said to CJ, that's the best we're going to get. That's the best we're going to get from her as a candidate. We're not getting anything more than that. Right. And there's a critique of Netanyahu. There's an emphasis on Palestinian suffering. There's a call for a ceasefire. That's what we're getting from her. We're not getting anything else. We're not going to we talk about self-determination. We're not going to talk about liberation. We're not going to talk about equality. Right. We're not going to stop giving them arms. Right. So there's deep constraints and grotesque constraints, frankly. And yet at the same time, right, there was that moment of shift. But I don't know that we'll ever know, what. I mean, my students were excited about her in terms of her identity and her background and even some of her progressive political positions, but they were really disappointed in her and the larger Democratic Party around Gaza, around immigration, right? I mean, she was like, I'll sign that draconian immigration bill, the border bill, first day one. And I'm like, really? That's what you're leaning into? And the way that the Democrats just leaned into the Trump immigration vortex and then couldn't get themselves out of the sort of long-standing master narrative about America's relationship with Israel, right, to me felt like two really big problems and frankly unforced errors that, no question, dampened the support they got from people like us and maybe prevented them from getting support from other folks, either people who voted against them actively or stayed home. And we won't know that for a while. I don't know if we'll ever fully know it. And to your point, I don't know if we'll ever fully know what was going on internally that led to her shift and then backtracking. But certainly internal polling numbers must have something to do with that.
Must have something to do with that, and brings up this, one of the things I had suggested we talk about, which we'll, I think, save for another show, because We do like to talk.
We like to talk. Yeah.
We are at the hour and a half mark.
Yeah.
This thing of, the Democratic National Party thinking that the way we run elections is to try to get the center or even the center right. And this kind of assumption people make that we live in a center right country,
Right.
when in fact, a majority of Americans actually agree with most of what the Democratic platform is.
Or
And
even
why,
the Democratic platform in some instances.
yeah.
Right.
And why the Democratic Party leadership thinks they need to keep chasing after this thing we're not. Like, we're not that. And, and then of course thinking that, Kamala won because the party's too woke. And it's like, that was not a woke campaign. Like, like of all the things that campaign was, woke was not one of them.
No.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
So, yeah, I feel like we could do like a whole hour on that issue alone.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a whole nother kind of conversation. I mean, for some people, the threshold for what is woke is like the mere existence of a woman of color in power. Like, I mean, let's be honest. Like, it doesn't have to get any more than that, right? Even that's significant. But so much of this is just symbolic stuff, right? Like, oh my God, there's a trans person who's playing youth soccer in Pennsylvania. It's like, wow, like really, like what? These are the things that we're concerned about. Like, one of my courses was on some list about these woke courses at Harvard, and they basically did a keyword search for like race, queer, gender, and like protest, and like my classes have all those words in them, and then all of a sudden, like, I'm on a list because I'm woke. I'm like, they didn't even look at the syllabus. They did a keyword search in a Google engine. Like, this is not serious and substantive political critiques, right? And then of course the left is like perseverates over like, maybe we've gone too far and maybe we need to shift our messaging, and I'm like, no, like, I'm going to continue to teach about race, gender, sexuality, protest, democracy, dissent, revolution, radicalism, rebelliousness. I'm going to keep teaching about that stuff because we need to. And
thank the goddess that you are.
The goddess. We can't submit to this nonsense.
Well, total nonsense. And also when it comes to the Democratic Party has always received more from Black communities, communities of color, queer communities, trans communities, and immigrants than they have ever given.
Amen to the same goddess. Woo! Let me just raise that. Oh my God, totally. And yet here we are. We're like, we keep giving it to them. I'm not, anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
It's true.
There's so much. I also want to come back around to like Guantanamo and Obama, and then Obama's relationship with Cuba, because I was like going to Cuba during that time, and
you were.
That's a whole interesting conversation about like what the Cubans were like seeing with him, and like his speech, that quite brilliant in many ways speech on Cuba, lifting the embargo, was like broadcast by Raul Castro all across the country on like state radio.
Wow.
Which is like, can you imagine, right? The last president's voice that they heard was Kennedy's, and wow. Like, yeah, like crazy, right? And so that's a whole other thing. And I'm dying to know like why you were so geeked out about Bill Clinton, because I never was geeked out about Bill Clinton. I didn't vote for him in the primary. The best part about the Clinton ticket from my perspective was Hillary, right? Like a version of Hillary that I like learned about, and the universal healthcare Hillary that they wanted to squash, right? She was the most interesting and exciting thing about that. And I've never liked Clinton. And I always said the difference between Obama and Clinton is that that Bill Clinton loved, like queer people especially, Bill Clinton loved us and left us, and Obama wanted to date us a little while longer before he made a commitment. And like that's like that to me is like the difference between. Clinton always felt to me to be such a transactional, like literally retail politician, in the most like basic and boring neoliberal model.
Well,
But
you were wiser than I was.
no, I don't even sound
No,
wisdom.
no, you were. You were.
Like the
I mean,
vibe.
I didn't think Bill Clinton was gonna like make all my dreams come true, but I did think I did I did get swayed by the energy
Yeah,
around his campaign and his rock star quality and a certain kind of like um the way in the 90s, certainly in that first campaign, and it was part of the reason he won and part of the reason that so many Republicans hated him, was that because he was, Democrat, liberal leaning, whatever we want to call it now, and a Southern Christian,
oh yeah, right.
like he could play a certain, rhetorical game and like, there's a little bit like that thing we love about Pete Buttigieg, that he can like go on Fox and like outfox the Fox people. I think
Yeah,
there was some of that going on with Clinton in
yeah,
92
yeah,
that I
yeah.
really enjoyed. And then and actually I will say, and I mean, I agree with you now, and clearly his need to be liked superseded any
Right.
political, um, belief or value that he held, right? Like that was the problem with him.
Yeah.
But I happened to catch live because I was in my last year of college. I saw his press conference where he announced lifting the ban on gays in the military. Now, obviously, he did it terribly. He had no idea what he was getting into. He didn't understand the power of homophobia, and he ultimately sold us down the river, right?
Right.
But that press conference,
Yeah, I remember that press conference. Yeah.
where he talked about the rampant sexual abuse happening in the military that goes unpunished, and yet all millions of dollars and tons of energy being spent to prosecute these people who are actually like doing their duty and, adding value to the military and aren't doing anything wrong, was so powerful. Like that was a powerful speech. Now it turns out, he's got his own sexual harassment issues, to say the least, but that was a very powerful speech.
Yeah. Well, I graduated from college in '93, and Colin Powell was our commencement speaker. We protested the "Don't Ask, Don't Tell" policy at my commencement. I had a pink triangle on my mortarboard, and I had a button that said "Why does Harvard honor hate?" and another button that said "Lift the ban." And like literally, like I was like in it, like same thing. Like we're the same vintage, you and I, right?
Yeah.
So I remember that press conference, and I remember being, and then I remember being like, oh, and but the thing about Clinton, which is interesting, because he is so, he's a genius on some level, and I don't want to take away from that the vibe, the energy, like and the rock starness of what he was, and Obama had that too for sure. And if you're in their company in person, if you ever see him sort of live, like you feel it on steroids. And Trump, I'm sure, has a version of that too, and I definitely saw Kamala had that too, right? I mean, Harris had that in her, and especially down the stretch. Whether it helped her or not, I don't know, but because that rock star quality can go in both directions, right? Like people can hate you because they hate that you're up there with Beyonce or Bruce Springsteen and like all these things, but they can also like love you because you're dazzling and charismatic and make you feel a kind of way. But one thing also that I think is really interesting, and it gets back to the breakdown piece, is like how broken these men are. Right, Bill Clinton was a broken man. Right, the dark side of Bill Clinton, right, came from deep brokenness. There was a quality of Obama that was broken. Right, his disrupted relationship with his father, his search for his own kind of identity. Right, his remove and distance at times from the people he's most intimate with, which we know about, and then Trump, of course. I mean, his brokenness is on display every day, and Biden's a broken man, right? When I think about it, like these, I mean, he's a broken man from the death of his, that catastrophic accident where he lost his wife and his kid, and you know, the way in which he, you know, constantly talks about the empty seat at the dinner table and the, you know, way that he's had to deal with his son's death of brain cancer and then his other son's addictions and foibles. Like there's something about like the breakdown of at least part of each of our existences as humans on the planet, that like when you're ordinary folks like us, like it's not everybody sees it, right? And it's not thrust on other people as the kind of burden that they have to carry or deal with in the way that it is when these big public figures and politicians, and here we're talking about like the men who have been president in the last several cycles, right, are, you know, it's, you know, there's that too. And I'm not trying to like be like, oh my God, we need to feel sorry for them and hold them and hug them and whatever, because they're, you know, at the end of the day, they're also arrogant and egotistical and, you know, narcissistic on some level. You got to be to run for president. But I also,
and perpetrators. I mean, not Obama, but like, and
right. Oh yeah, totally.
Yeah.
But like what's that? I mean, we've been talking about the breakdown that like politics induces, or that elections induce, or that Trump in particular has induced, right? But like, what about the breakdowns that those people embody? And like, what role does that play on us as the governed?
Yeah. And I mean, what are we having mirrored, right? Like, if everything is a mirror of the self, like if Trump is a mirror of this country's, like, you know, sort of greed,
yeah,
and, you know, like this, like our genocidal origins, you know, life, liberty, property, you know, like, like he's sort of feeding back to us, you know, our racist,
the worst
capitalist, greed-based cruelty that clearly still exists here, or he would not be popular, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, what was Clinton mirroring back for us? And I mean, this is where, you know, and it's very rare with people who are ambitious enough to want to be president. This is where whatever brokenness Obama had, like, was organized within himself in a cohesive way that he could manage.
And he was thoughtful and reflective about it, and honest in public about that, in a way that the others that I mentioned are. And Biden actually, in some ways, has been thoughtful and reflective and honest, and, you know, willing to be a little messy, right? I do think there's a categorical difference between the different people. I don't mean to say they're all the same in terms of their brokenness and how it functions, but
it brings up something interesting about Bill Clinton too, because, you know, the whole Ken Starr thing, and you know, I think many things are true. I think it was none of our business what was happening, like who Clinton was having sex with, and the Republicans just exploited his greatest weakness to disempower him so that he couldn't get anything done. And when I think about this, what was he at the time? 45, 50-year-old man sitting behind the Oval Office desk with this 18-year-old intern hanging around. Like, it's so disgusting. It's so
what? His teenage daughter, who was about the same age as Monica Lewinsky, right? It's like, oh God.
It's so vile. But then the big mistake that Al Gore made a lot of mistakes in the 2000 campaign, but one of the big mistakes they made was buying into the Republican line of like restoring dignity to the White House. Because the truth is, men loved that shit.
Loved it.
And Gore should have been sending Clinton out everywhere to campaign for him.
Absolutely.
Because the truth is, somewhere deep down, it made him a little more popular. Like, underneath the sort of surface puritanical outrage, the dudes were all about it.
Yeah, totally. And then what does Al Gore do? He picks Joe Lieberman, the finger-wagging kind of Democrat, to be his running mate, right? It wasn't like he just like bought into it. He like literally took the like Democratic like standard bearer of the puritanical finger wagging and made him his running mate.
Which was so like, I had forgotten about Joe Lieberman. Wow.
And then
That's
he
a
becomes
fact.
an independent, and then he's not even a Democrat, right? It's like Joe Manchin. Oh,
Yeah,
anyway.
which we knew.
Yeah, right,
Like,
right, exactly.
duh.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, I have to say, like, I didn't vote for Nader, and I think his tagline, like, there's no difference between the Democrats and the Republicans, is kind of irresponsible, and we can dig into that some other time. But I mean, Al Gore really made it hard to differentiate the Democrats from the Republicans that year.
He did. And that was a time when like that claim by Nader was so much more proximate to a truth than ever is now. Like the idea that, I mean, when people do this and people on the left do it all the time, right?
All the time.
All the time. Like there's no difference between the parties. No, that is not true. Like, and I'm a lefty, you're a lefty. Like that is not true. You cannot say that right now and have any sense of reality when you're talking about political analysis and argue that there's no difference between the two parties. Like, you know, and that's not to free or exonerate the Democratic Party from accountability on all the things we've been talking about on immigration and Gaza, et cetera, et cetera. But I mean, come on now. There are differences, right? Like, for instance, the other day when Kamala Harris certified the results of the 2024 election, our people weren't scaling the outside the Capitol calling for her to be hung.
Which comes around to something you said at the beginning, which I think is a great way to end, which is, that difference that she stood there and helped certify that vote, and nobody was beating up police officers and
calling for her hanging.
Yeah. So here we are. Well, Tim, if people are saying, if people are saying that part of what they need right now is community and connection and conversation, you are someone, if for no other reason, I'm very happy I had this idea so that we can have some connection and conversation. I hope that it's, creates some space or light or, context for others. And, I look forward to more.
Yeah, me too. I think about the impulse to mutual aid, right? When communities are in need of things, and sometimes that comes along with suffering and struggle. And I get back to the point you made earlier about your anxiety spiking. So like we're like, this feels like a kind of mutual aid society, but also like a mutual anxiety society. So I'm so happy to be in community and anxiety.
Or mutual anxiety society.
Yeah. So
hopefully
other people will find it mutually satisfying as well. But it's great to be with you, and I can't wait to keep it going.
Keep digging in. All right, more soon.
Take care.
Bye.